thank you very much to the Cooperative Development Foundation for inviting me. I will tell you the first thing is that it's CFED, not CFED, makes us sound like a federal agency of uncertain origins, so we always like to say CFED. And it's I think, very pleasing for me today to be here, focused on issues and strategies that rarely get on the national agenda, and as I was thinking, or at events in this very building. So we've had wonderful speakers, both from CFED and others, partners of ours, that have talked about cooperative development, manufactured housing, rural and senior housing. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm not an expert on any of these topics. I was born in Brooklyn, so my rural experience is extremely limited. I have lived in site-built housing all my life, and as I was remembering last night when I was writing this, I once took over a food co-op in college because the directors were so painfully slow serving lunch that you couldn't have enough time to get your lunch between your classes, and I felt like extreme actions were called for. So, but my job at CFED really involves us recognizing innovations that solve long-term problems to build both financial security and opportunity, and to deploy markets, public policy, and community practice to scale them. And it's really in that position that I'm talking with you today. Today's session, both this morning and afternoon, addresses three issues that are very core to CFED's mission. First, innovative efforts underway to transform the manufactured housing marketplace and to turn homeownership in manufactured housing communities or on fee simple land into moves to create financial security and opportunity. It also talks about the role of cooperatives in empowering owners of manufactured homes to bring financial stability to their lives and economic value to their communities. And while it may not be as explicit, and that's really my job today, it's about the power and necessity of adopting an ambitious asset building strategy, including, but not limited to, the availability of affordable housing to restore a sense of hope and opportunity in this nation. Many people have come up to me during the break to ask how things at CFED are doing, and our focus has been for 32 years to deal with the level of wealth inequality in this country. That's been a very lonely task for much of the last 3 decades. It has become much less lonelier over the last year, and I want to begin really talking about that. So why is the work we're discussing here today not just critical to rural communities and to seniors, but to the entire nation? And I want to begin by sharing with you 2 numbers that have been highlighted by the media, both in the United States and even internationally, that came out of the release of CFED's Assets and Opportunities Scorecard on January 31st. How many of you have had a chance to look at the scorecard in any way, shape, or form since it came out? So, just a few. So the scorecard is the most comprehensive benchmarking tool of how the states help build and protect the assets of its residents, and it has 5 indexes, and 1 is all about housing and homeownership, looking both at rental and homeownership, but it also looks at financial income and assets, education, healthcare, and jobs and small businesses. The first number that I want to talk about is a metric that we created 10 years ago when we issued the first scorecard, which is a number called asset poverty. And this is in complement to income poverty. And part of the work that we have done is basically saying that income is necessary but not complete in creating financial security. And the stories, for example, that Stacy described when she described Ms. Kelly, As I always tell that story, I love that story, because it changes both the profit and loss statement and the balance sheet for Mrs. Kelly. And so you're looking at both what do you earn, or how do you save what goes out on a daily basis, and then what do you own. So we created a metric called asset poverty 10 years ago, which basically says a household, an American household, is in asset poverty if they don't have enough resources to exist at the poverty level for 3 months if their main source of income is disrupted. In 2009, when we released the last scorecard, 22.5% of U.S. households lived in asset poverty, compared to a poverty rate then of about 10%. When we released the scorecard at the end of January, that number had risen to 27% of U.S. households, compared to a 14% poverty rate for households, even though it's a 15% poverty rate for individuals. But that's just looking at your net worth. And we know that there's multiple components of net worth, and not all of it is easily accessible if something happens. So for the very first time, we created a new metric called liquid asset poverty. And what this metric measures is out of your net worth, it takes out the value of your home, your car, and a business if you own it, because those are not easily converted to cash. And it says when you take that out, what's left if something happens? 43% of American households today live in liquid asset poverty. And I have to say, that number has changed the entire conversation. The day after we released the scorecard, we were the front page of the Huffington Post. And their headline was, almost half of U.S. households, one crisis from the breadline. Later that day, we got called by the BBC for an interview, and I said to my communications director, well, Al Jazeera is next. And sure enough, they called the next day. But I think the point here is that it wasn't just about those poor people. It was about almost half of the United States, and how we fundamentally need to be rethinking across the board about how we rebuild financial security. And this really aligns with Shelley's point earlier before, when she was talking about the work they're doing around financial insecurity in seniors and the connections there with affordable housing. So this is the context that I really want you to keep in mind as we think about how we design and deliver effective housing solutions to build economic security. And before I talk specifically on the housing side, I want to share with you a framework that CFED developed over the last several years about how do we think of all the pieces it takes to build financial security. And so we've come up with a framework which, as my board member said, this is the greatest single piece of paper that CFED has ever produced, ever, called the Household Financial Security Framework. And it has 5 elements to it. And one of the things it says really visually and specifically is there's no silver bullet to building financial security. And if one can look at the microfinance field and say the greatest tragedy that ever happened to microfinance is that people presented it as a silver bullet, when it is a valuable tool, but not the whole story. So the 5 elements that we have is first, learn financial skills and build the human capital that's necessary to succeed. Number 2 is earn income and the public benefits that help you raise the household income level. 3 is save for emergencies and for the long term. And I think one of the areas that we see great innovation in is what are the short-term savings products that can compete with our check cashers and payday lenders that have stripped so much wealth? And then what are the necessary long-term financial products that help us save for the future and for our children? 4 is invest in assets that generate wealth and income, and in many cases, housing has been the prime strategy within this category. But we also know, and we'll talk about this a little bit, what a profound reevaluation that is having in today's economy. And then 5 is really the issue that we paid way too little attention to, which is protect. And to protect the gains made both by avoiding predatory practices and through insurance. So those are the 5 elements that we think working together really builds household financial security. And what we think about is how does affordable housing, whether it's rental or home ownership, fit into that framework? And what role does it play? And how does that role change over time? So, what do we know about housing affordability in the wake of the financial crisis? As I said earlier, given what's happened over the last several years, we are really in the midst of a national reassessment of the role of housing and homeownership, and Terry Simonet spoke very candidly about that reevaluation earlier today, in our definition of the American dream, which has really enshrined the goal for so many Americans that they view the mortgage interest deduction as a constitutional right, rather than a policy strategy of a certain place and time. And while the foreclosure crisis and its aftermath has really devastated, for many of us, our faith of homeownership as the surest route to financial security, it has forced us to think about a much broader range of housing options that can help meet the needs of Americans, including a much stronger role for cooperative solutions. And I thought, particularly when Terry was detailing the data on the extraordinary performance and lack of delinquencies within cooperative housing, that underscored it all. A recent report by the Center on Housing Policy echoes the findings of CFED's Assets and Opportunities Scorecard that the affordable housing crisis has not abated, even considering the drop in housing prices in many communities over the last several years. So what they cited was that nearly 1 in 4 working households spends more than half of the household income on housing. So that's a very high level of cost burden and rent burden, and we have that same number echoed in the scorecard. And despite falling home prices and values, housing affordability over the last several years has actually worsened for working homeowners. And working renters have fared even worse. While prices have gone down slightly, incomes have gone down at twice the rate of housing costs. So we haven't even gotten relief on this part of the bargain. So how do we think about this question? And I'll really begin where we left off in the last panel, is to identify solutions that actually expand the stock of affordable housing, and that's where we start. Last May, CFED sponsored a session on kind of the role of manufactured housing within the policy context, and had 11 different federal agencies with some role in manufactured housing, some of them not even knowing that they did, to really look at the solutions. And one of our long-term colleagues from Freddie Mac, after he had heard the panels, came up to me and he said, you know, this is one of only 2 ideas I've ever heard about in my career that actually expands the stock of affordable housing rather than just moving subsidies around. And so I think our task today, and the panels earlier today and later today, I think are really at the heart of this is how do we change where the housing comes from and then who gets that? And I think we can look at manufactured housing both in terms of its untapped potential to expand our stock, and also in the questions that were raised earlier today on the cost structure, on the cost effectiveness that it provides to the homeowners, particularly given that in the political environment that we are facing, it's all about how do we take low-value uses of funds and put them in higher value contexts. And that's really the approach we're taking to public policy. It is in this recognition that CFED launched I'm Home, and Rick spoke so eloquently about it before 6 years ago. What distinguishes I'm Home from everything CFED has done before, and many of you may know our work in testing individual development accounts and match savings, and more recently in testing children's savings accounts as a core strategy to break the intergenerational transfer of poverty, is that I'm Home is our first explicit strategy to change markets rather than change policy. Now, we've always deployed policy as a tool before, but our goal had been, let's create a universal children's savings account for every child. With I'm Home, we're really using policy as a tool to change how markets work for the folks that we care most about. And then it's no surprise that given that's been our strategy, that the core tool we've been working with is social enterprises. And as you'll hear from Mike later about Rock USA, and as you've already heard from Stacy, here's a whole strategy to use social enterprise as the vehicle by which we make market change. One of the core contributions, I think, is how our social enterprise and policy strategy is also aligning with core changes in the marketplace. So Stacy and I often talk about the fact that the technological changes in the construction of manufactured housing and the energy efficiencies, I think, is going to have a huge impact on flipping the stigma that we have had so often. My mother lives in Naples, Florida, and you may be familiar with Naples, Florida. It's a gated community of another sort. But one of the growing industries is manufactured housing for the retirees who are coming down and building their dream houses at a slightly different price point than Stacy's doing, but really the same exact technologies. And what happens is that no longer gets associated with the kind of stereotypes that we have. Later, you're going to hear from Mike about what Rock USA has done. And really, there's 2 points about Rock USA that I want to make, which is how do we achieve scalable solutions in changing the face of opportunity? So Rock USA is modeled, as most of you probably know, on a very successful 20-plus year strategy in New Hampshire, which has succeeded in converting over 20% of the marketplace of manufactured housing communities. And so when we were thinking as part of I'm Home, well, do we just seed a lot of innovations all over the country and just kind of see what happens out of that? Paul Bradley, who runs Rock USA now, said, you know what? In 10 years, we'll be having a conference, and we'll be thinking about how do we create a network, and how do we create common standards, and everybody will be structured differently, and nobody can get the same financing, and blah, 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 blah. So why don't we try to create one scalable strategy operating with consistent standards, structures, and methodologies to take this to scale from the start. And as much as we love our unique ideas as nonprofits, I think this is the future of how we scale social enterprise. I was recently on a panel with Amidar, who founded Idealist.org, and he sat on the panel and he said, my goal is to convince every 25-year-old that they don't need their own nonprofit. And I thought, that's right. That's exactly right. We need to figure out how we create fewer organizations with broader ownership in them. Finally, on this score, we are in the process of creating our third social venture to fill the last missing market element, which is single-family finance. Many of you know that these markets don't work because A, owners of manufactured housing, when they buy their home, can't get access to high-quality conventional financing. It's just the whole predatory market all over again. And then second, if somebody wants to buy their home, there's absolutely no financing to be had. So where's the market and where's the value of your home? No wonder people say, oh, that housing stock depreciates immediately. If you don't have a functioning financing market, then that market can't operate as it should. So that's our last piece, and as I said earlier to Liz, we're also working very closely with credit unions on helping to develop this marketplace. So I began my remarks really sharing sobering data on the level of financial insecurity in the U.S., followed by the household financial security framework, not basically to show us how hard our job is, but how much we are actually learning about strategies that build financial security and opportunity, and how we apply that learning to develop new and approved solutions for both affordable and senior housing. And I will end my remarks by borrowing a metaphor from our friends in the healthcare sector, because we had several conversations about healthcare today, and it's not just because my son's in medical school, and encourage you to take your super vitamin to work with you every day. So what do I mean by that? One of my favorite leaders in our field is a man named Jonathan Mintz, who's the commissioner of the Department of Consumer Affairs for New York City. And New York City, I don't know how many of you have followed this, has done some of the most innovative work on really helping to build financial security for its residents. And he said at our Assets Learning Conference a year and a half ago, he said, asset building is the super vitamin that makes anti-poverty programs work better. So we can play our Mad Libs game and put anything in that word that makes affordable housing work better, that makes social services work better, and I see these examples all the time. There's a great workforce development program, and nobody pays attention. Are these folks getting banked? So they get a job, they get a check, and then they go to the check casher. So how do we think about integrating these strategies, just as we talked about the household financial security framework? Over the past 6 months, and this shows you how short a period of time, CFED has been approached by affordable housing developers, national housing intermediaries, and housing authorities, all seeking to integrate financial access, savings, and other asset development programs into their communities. This trend has taught me two things, which I think is relevant to our conversation today. Affordable housing can be, and already is, a platform for a range of interventions that build financial security and, as we talked about, the ability to age in place, the ability to lower healthcare costs, the ability to provide employment opportunities for other people in your communities. And secondly, we need to cross silos and sectors to ensure we are connecting strategies that together can accomplish what cannot be done separately. For example, I was approached by one of the leading affordable housing developers in the country who'd just gotten a huge Choice Community Grant. They had over $1 million to help build economic independence, and they asked me to come up with a plan for them. I sat down with 5 of the people on the leadership team, and they collectively had 100 years of experience in affordable housing and working with low-income people. And I said, the first thing we want to do is get a VITA site in this community. VITA site? Volunteer tax prep site? Not a single person around the table knew what a VITA site was. And they had been working in low-income communities all their lives. And so, to me, some of this is kind of easy to do, but it also speaks to how separate our fields have been as we think about this. And finally, our affordable housing work cannot truly be sustainable without affirmative efforts to reinvent how and what we are doing that actively address the unprecedented level of financial security in this country. So your task today is really to be at the forefront of creating the future of affordable rental and senior housing. It may require you to embrace new approaches, such as manufactured housing. It may require you to identify new partners, such as Vita sites or community development credit unions. And it may require you to align your political interests with a broader wealth creation agenda, of which affordable housing is just a part of how to succeed in a world where even the mortgage interest deduction may no longer be sacred. So thank you for the honor of being with you today, and I wish you all a productive day. Thank you.